Okay, this is also from the ACSM book, Chapter 6, Part 2. So it's Part 2 of the aerobic aspect. This just shows a graph. If you graphed your results from your VO2 max test against heart rate, you'd see generally a linear response. When you're looking at exercise duration, prescribed as a measure of the amount of physical activity performed, 30 to 60 minutes, 150 minutes a week. If you do the vigorous 20 to 60 minute sessions, 75 minutes per week of vigorous, and we'll talk about met minutes in a minute. For weight management, you need to do longer, 60 to 90 minutes. So in the previous video, I said there's basically for all intents and purposes, a limitless amount of moderate aerobic activity you could do, and that's where that 60 to 90 minutes is coming into play. If that 60 to 90 minutes is vigorous, that's going to be tough, especially for somebody that needs to lose weight. But if you're looking at walking or moderate activity, then sometimes that activity does need to be higher and in greater amounts, greater time. The recommended time duration may be performed continuously, or it could be broken down into 10-minute sessions. So I remember when this came out, it was actually a colleague of mine that said this, and I was like, man, that sounds like the dumbest thing ever. But it ended up being a pretty big thing, and it's kind of gotten a lot of traction, which is if you do 3 10-minute bouts, it's the same as one 30-minute bout of exercise. So to take activity breaks, or especially for deconditioned obese individuals, to do multiple shorter sessions, that's something that's fine, and you can reach your physical activity goals by doing that. If you do less than 10 minutes, it goes back into the category of something is better than nothing. So that's good from that perspective, but we'd like people to generally get at least 10 minutes of activity. And usually that activity is moderate, so it goes back to the warm-up and cool-down. We're not necessarily recommending people do 10 minutes of all-out, high-intensity types of activity. That may or may not be reasonable, probably not reasonable in most instances. So, most of the time, even when they're doing those 10 minutes, it's not high-intensity stuff, but more on the moderate end of things. So to accumulate that 30 to 60 minutes, 150 minutes a week, a combination of moderate and vigorous, it doesn't matter which one you do or how you do it. It could be continuous, it could be discontinuous, either way is fine. The type of activity, this is just describing aerobic activity. Rhythmic aerobic types of exercise involving large muscle groups are recommended. It's a fancy way of saying things like running, things like cycling, swimming, where you're doing the same movement pattern basically time and time and time again. And even if you're doing like a Zumba or something like that, that would fall into these categories as well. The specificity just basically states that if you do this type of activity, you're going to improve your aerobic performance. Pretty obvious. This breaks it down by different types of, it puts it into different exercise groups. Who it's recommended for, it basically describes it. In Group A, your basic types of activities, you don't need skill, you don't need fitness, everybody can do them. You have vigorous activities where you don't really need any skill, but let's say if you're running, you need to be aerobically fit. So it gives you a list: running, rowing, aerobics, elliptical, stepping, dancing, especially if it's a faster type of I would put dancing at C, personally. You got to have some skill to do that, unless it's like a free dance, where even if it looks stupid, it's okay. If people are part of a dance class, the girls especially in the class that may have participated in dance and that's the way they did their physical activity as they were growing up. Great activity. I would put that more at the C level. That is not easy to do, and it's a higher intensity. There's definitely a skill associated with it. Endurance activities that require a skill, so a lot of swimming, cross-country skiing, skating, and a lot of your, well, I mean, they put sports, recreational sports, into the next category. It depends on, are you doing the sport at the youth level, at the collegiate level, where you're doing it on a very regular basis, or are you doing it kind of a once in a while? And then if the level D is recreational sports, you should have at least average levels of fitness. And for the adults, they may be doing these activities once a week. They may be doing these activities once in a while, as opposed to the level C activities where people may be doing that on a more regular basis, multiple, two, 3 times a week potentially. As opposed to recreational sports, they may be spaced out and few and far between. And with the rec sports, you gotta, with the rec sports, you also have to watch out for, going back. The thing to watch out for is the weekend warrior. To be a weekend warrior is fine, it's good. It's a good way to get physical activity, but it's also a good way to get injured. So you need to be careful and make sure that those activities you do in a safe manner. You take a middle-aged guy, he's trying to relive his college days, especially his high school days. That can get ugly, and people can get hurt. They think they're more physically fit than they actually are, and they run into problems. So that's probably a big thing with recreational sports, is to make sure you're doing it at an appropriate intensity, and doing it in a safe manner, because that is a good recipe for getting hurt. This just restates what we have here, what I said previously. So moving on. The quantity, you're looking at the volume, and you're putting the frequency, intensity, and time together. So it's putting the FITT aspect together. And it's a way to estimate gross energy expenditure. And this is why I did the lab the way that I did it, because I find volume very hard to estimate. But if you have the base of what you did in the lab, then you could use those activities and refer the new activities and figure out things, how they related to what you did in the lab. So if you expended 250 calories doing the 60% VO2 reserve for 20 minutes, then if you're outside and you're doing an activity and you're like, oh, it wasn't super hard, but it was a workout, but it was something I could do and maintain, probably felt like my moderate day, or it felt way easier, way harder, whatever the case may be. What I would say is to determine exercise energy expenditure, that you relate it to a known quantity that you know, and then you could base it off of that. Well, 20 minutes of that, I burned 250 calories. I did this activity for an hour. It was kind of at that level. I'd say I probably burned 750 calories. That, I think, is reasonable, and I think that's the way you should go. It's difficult if you don't have a known quantity to compare it to. When you go out and play basketball, play soccer, football, how many calories are you expending? How do you feel at the end of that exercise session? That's kind of the issue. Now, the MET minute and MET minutes per week, calories per week, can use to estimate exercise volume in a standardized manner. And now you have a better ability to do that. Metabolic equivalence, I've talked about this before. 1 MET is equal to 3.5 mLs per kg per minute, and that represents the oxygen consumption at rest. And we work off of multiples of that. Why? I don't know, but that's what we work off of. So I would prefer the VO2 number. I think I personally like it better. But that's not what we work off of. We work off of METs. That's what's available in the research literature and the pop culture and everything. So that's what we use. MET minutes is multiplying basically the intensity of the exercise times time, and I like that. I wish it were used more, because if you're walking or running, how do we compare these things? if people are outside playing a sport and you can relate it to the number of minutes you expended during the lab, then you can figure out or guesstimate of the amount of minutes you expended. But otherwise, if you don't have something to compare it to, I still believe it's fairly difficult. But it is a good value, and if you're able to calculate it and able to arrive at a value, then I think it's something that's very useful. Kilocalories. This is good from especially a weight loss perspective. How many calories are you expending? You can calculate that. We calculated that in the lab. They give their example, jogging at 7 mets. Again, think about that. What intensity are they jogging at? What speed are they going at for 7 mets? I mean, that's 4 miles an hour. That is very slow, a very slow jog. So if they're jogging at 4 miles an hour, and why don't they state jogging at 4 miles per hour is 7 mets? I don't know, but I believe that they should. So if you're running or jogging at 4 miles an hour, which is 7 mets, for 30 minutes, 3 times a week, it's 630 minutes. And if you think about running at 4 miles per hour, I think that's pretty easy for probably everybody. And for many of you, you think of running at 4 miles an hour and you're like, geez, that's kind of like slow. That feels uncomfortable. For other people, it might feel completely fine, and that's great. But for others, it definitely feels slow. And for many, you feel like I'd rather walk at that speed than run. And if you walk, the numbers go down significantly. But you can kind of get a gauge and estimate of how many calories you expended, how many minutes you expended, and that's definitely useful. So what we want for the energy expenditure is to expend about 500 to 1,000 minutes per week. When you do the calculations and manipulate the math, you can see if you're following the basic recommendations, the 30 minutes, 150 minutes a week, 30 minutes a session of moderate activity, that will basically get you to that 500 minute level. And then if you do more, you expend more. And you can see, like for some of you, if you do high levels of aerobic activity, you can expend a lot of calories. You can expend a lot of your minute amount can be very, very high. And it's going to vary. Are you sedentary? Sedentary people might get a lot less than 500. But people that are active, hopefully most of you guys in the class, the number of minutes can far exceed even that 1,000. And that 500, you meet it easy. I put this together. I like this, so I did it. And this kind of gives you a chart for running speed, and I think the next one, for the next one I do walking speeds, so that you have some numbers to kind of go off of and some reference points. It's hard to do this for anything else but running and walking. It's just the way it is. That's why I use that as the base activity and base everything else off of those activities. So 4 miles an hour is basically 7 mets. I put the basically values in parentheses. They're much easier to work off of. I think they're much easier to remember. They're not as accurate as the calculated values, but they get you pretty close. So so that's what I do. So 4 miles an hour is 7 mets. 5 miles per hour is 8.5. 6 is 10. 7 is 11.5, 8 is 13, 9 is 14.5, 10 is 16. I went through those in case you have a real problem reading. But anyway, I had a student and she said, oh, it looks like it's a 1.5 increment from one to the next. And I was like, yeah, it is pretty much a 1.5 increment. So if you just remember 6 miles an hour and then work up or down 1.5 mets accordingly, if it's more or less, then you can kind of figure out the met level for a lot of different running speeds, which then you can base other things off of that. I provide the VO2 levels as well. They're nice numbers, but the reality is nobody uses them, even though I feel like it's a more accurate more accurate telling of the oxygen consumption. And it's the same thing with the speed of walking. Roughly, the speed that you're walking at is the MET level. It's not perfect. It works okay. So at 2 miles an hour, it's 2.5 METs. That's not the best. 2.5 miles an hour is basically 3 METs, but 3 miles an hour is pretty much 3 METs as well. It gets a little bit better after that. 3.5 is 3.7 or 3.5. It's just if you do a quick estimate, 4 miles an hour is 4 METs. So if you're looking at most of the walking speeds that you go at, if we run at 4 miles an hour because of the upward momentum associated with running, you're exercising at about 7 METs. But if you're walking at 4 miles an hour, then your MET level is approximately 4 METs. So there's a big difference between walking versus running, and this is part of the problem with walking and running is you have that gap. And that's where you have the individuals that say, I can't run. Yes, because they can walk, and they walk at 4 miles an hour, they can maintain that speed, and it's 4 METs, and it's relatively not that hard to do it. So then they decide, okay, I'm going to start to run. I'm going to run at 4.5 miles an hour, because you wouldn't run at the same speed that you walk. That seems counterintuitive. You're going to run at something faster, just mentally. That's what we do. But then when you run at 4.5 miles per hour, you've gone from 4 METs to 7, 7.5, 8 METs. You're almost doubling the exercise intensity. And yeah, if you think about doubling the exercise intensity, the chances that you'll be able to do that there's a good chance you will not be able to do that. And that's kind of what we deal with. And that's why I present the numbers, so you can kind of see how they're working out and what's kind of going on with this moderate to significant part of the population that can walk, but they will say, I can't run. And this is the reasoning for it. And I think if you understand that, that's helpful. It's also helpful to realize that if you're running, as weird as it seems, you may be running at the same speed you can walk at. And even though that seems awkward and less efficient, that's the lack of efficiency will mean you're burning more calories. And at the end of the day, that's what you want, is to burn more calories. So that's a way of getting there. And if you're trying to get to a specific MET level, you have to include a speed and a grade and an incline. That's the way to get to the appropriate intensities. And if you're doing that, don't hold on. That's the other thing I see all the time. People holding on for dear life when they're on the treadmill. Don't do that. That affects the MET levels. So you want to make sure that whatever you do, you could do without holding on. The only reason you should hold on is if you're an older individual with some sort of balance issue. If those individuals hold on, okay. But generally for most of us, you should never really be holding on. If you hold on at the end of the test while the treadmill's slowing down, that's fine, and that's recommended. But if you're doing a workout, really for pretty much all the aerobic equipment, you should never hold on. If you're doing the elliptical, you should not, unless you're using the arm aspect of it. But if you're not using the arm aspect, you just have to get proper posture. You don't have to hold on. The step mill, the stair steppers, you don't have to hold on. The lateral machine, I don't know what it's called, in the arc, it's good for lateral movement. You should not be holding on. You do life without holding on to things. When you're in the gym, you should not have to hold on. It's there for safety. It's there if you lose your balance, but generally, you should have a level of core stability where you don't have to hold on. So minute basics, if you're running for 30 minutes at 6 miles an hour, you're expending 300 calories, but if you're walking for 30 minutes at 3 miles per hour, you're basically expending 90, or you have 300 MET minutes. I forgot the MET there. Whoops. And if you're walking at 3 miles an hour, you're expending for the same amount of time 90 MET minutes. So between walking and running, you're essentially tripling the amount of met minutes, the amount of met minutes, and if you're 30 minutes at 6 miles per hour is going to equal an hour and 40 minutes at 3 miles an hour. So if you do the walking, it's fine, but you have to do a lot more of it as opposed to the higher intensity stuff. So if time is an issue, the higher intensity and becoming more fit to be able to do the higher intensity is an issue. So I kind of restate what I just mentioned, the walking, running, treadmill conundrum. That if you're walking, the MET value is fairly low, but if you're running at the same speed, your MET value increases greatly. 4 miles an hour is roughly 7 METs, but then 5 miles an hour is 8.5 METs. So it's a significant 5 miles an hour, 8.5 METs is a significant increase. If you're doing other things, and sometimes it's nice if people just ran because it would be easy to quantify, that would be great. But running's not for everybody, and we do a lot of different activities. And sometimes you see that people are just active. They're not particularly doing a specific mode of activity, but their job is keeping them active. And using a pedometer or a activity tracker, and now they seem to be very common, and the Apple Watches are, I would imagine they're becoming more and more common. I do not have an Apple Watch. I've seen many of you with Apple Watches, and I will probably get an Apple Watch sometime in the future. But all these things are tracking physical activity, and they're mainly what they are is they are accelerometers, so they could technically measure activity and movement in different directions and planes, which is good. I don't know how much they actually do that. But typically what they are, what mine is in reality is just a souped up Bluetooth pedometer. It's a pedometer that sends information to my cell phone, and then that cell phone they put into nice graphs and record the data and things like that. And that's kind of nice. It gives you some good information. And that's a good tool, especially if people are saying, oh, I'm active, or I don't have time to do physical activity. Okay, well, let's slap a activity tracker and let's see how many steps are you getting. Are you getting 3,000 steps a day, or are you getting 10,000 steps a day? You work at Walmart, you work at Lowe's, one of these big box stores. You work as a restaurant, as a server. You work at Amazon. How many steps are you getting? Because depending on what your responsibility is, if you're working at Walmart or Lowe's or one of those types of stores, Home Depot, and you're a cashier, you might not be getting that many steps. If you're working as somebody that's stocking shelves, you may be getting a ton of steps. And then even when you look around and you see our janitorial staff, they've got a job where they're walking around. But really, how many steps are they getting? And I would imagine it probably depends on the individual. If you have an activity tracker, you can get a better idea of how many steps they're getting. They may be taking a lot of breaks, sitting around, not doing much. They're not going to have as many steps. Somebody else may have a lot more responsibilities, maybe getting a lot more physical activity. These activity trackers and step counters, they can give you something to work off of. And if you see, oh, this person's expending completing 8,000 steps a day on average, then the aerobic portion, okay, we want them maybe to get a little bit more, but maybe the focus is more on resistance exercise or flexibility or core or whatever. But if we see that the step count is low, we want to get that up. And I'll tell you, I think it's a good idea if you have a step counter to look at that information, and if you talk to your friends about the step counter data. That's actually a good point for discussion. I'll probably bring it up during the discussion. If you have a activity tracker, how many steps do you actually get? Because when I look at the high values, if I run in a day, I'll probably get about 15,000 steps that day if I go for some sort of run that's 30 to 45 minutes. which is a pretty typical. If I run outside, I'll go for that amount of time. And then, so that'll be about 15,000 steps, give or take. If I go to an amusement park, that's where I really get a lot of steps. I'll get 25,000 steps on those types of days. But when I was grading case studies, when I was sick and at home and not going out of the house, on those days I could get I'd say 3,500 steps, give or take. And I live in a 2-story home, so if you take that and you live in an apartment, which I'd imagine most of you do, and you're sick or you stay in the apartment all day, the number of steps can be very, very low. You don't have to just get that much activity moving around in your apartment. So knowing these can kind of give you a jumping off point to see, okay, what do we have to focus on? What do we have to do? So the target, this is just reiterating, 500 to 1,000 net minutes. 5,400 to 7,900 steps is kind of the minimum level. Obviously more is better. 1,000 calories a week. When you do the math, all this kind of works together. It's consistent. It might not be 100% lined up, but all of them are pretty close. So the issue and the question that I raised to you is, like, who knows this information? Who out there, exercise physiologists, personal trainers out there, how many people determine net minutes? How many people are determining calories expended per week? How many people are looking at the steps? A lot of times this stuff is just not done. But these are good tools, and if you're really trying to help individuals, you should be using these tools. I can't force you to use these tools in the future, but I can strongly recommend them, and that's what I'm doing. So these things work, they work well. You need to figure out, how do I use them? How do I frame them? How do I know? This is where critical thinking comes into play. How do I use the information that I know and apply it? And how do I figure out, how does this get the person that I'm working to improve their health and improve their health and potentially improve their performance? Of course, this is all health related. It's much less performance related. So running and walking, you're probably sick of this. It's easy to quantify. Did I tell you it's easy to quantify? It's easy to quantify. That's one of the best things. It's easy to quantify. I like it because it's easy to quantify. Okay. Everything else is more difficult. Factors include skill, fitness level, the nuances of the activity. So am I doing this? Am I playing basketball with my son, which means I'm just walking around and shooting the ball occasionally? Or are you guys playing basketball and it's fairly competitive? Are you doing a little bit of one-on-one with your friend? Or are you doing having a larger group? What's going on? That's going to change the caloric expenditure. That's going to change that activity, and it's going to vary to a fair extent from person to person. And you've got to ask those questions to kind of figure that out. So my recommendation, I've said it a bunch. I tried to put a funny in there. I realize you might not ever. The running model's great. I realize you might never run again. But that's okay unless you're chased by a bear. Haha, yeah, so funny. But even if you don't run, having that as a base, is something that you can work off of in the future. Calculating calories, I just put this in there, just for your reference. I put in the chemistry stuff to show how we arrive at the number. I don't know if anybody cares, but this is how we get to the number. For progression, the recommended rate of progression in an exercise program depends on the individual's health status, fitness, training response, exercise program goals. As with strength training and aerobic training, progression is going to vary. You can decide on how you want to do the progression. you're going to increase different aspects of the activity. Generally, they want people to increase the duration first. But for the people you're working with, that may be appropriate. If you're with a middle-aged, older individual that can't really exercise for long periods of time, all they could do is 15 minutes. Hey, well, let's try to work that up to 30 minutes. But for you guys, a lot of times you're already starting at a pretty good fitness level. You may increase the intensity first. You may adjust other aspects of the activity. So they give you different recommendations. The key here is generally to start conservative, start low and go slow. That's fine and that's great. You want to make sure that you keep progressing. So a lot of times you get a sedentary individual, you start conservative, they're like, oh, this is good, I can do exercise. And they really don't progress beyond that. And that may improve health, but they're not going to see results, and they may get a little frustrated with that. If they want to see true improvements, you need to make sure that that progression keeps on going throughout the exercise program. A lot of it for aerobic hinges on weight loss. As you continue to lose weight, your aerobic performance will improve. That's true at the elite level. You'll see runners, they'll be very skinny because the less weight you carry, the faster it's going to make you. It becomes a diminishing return when you're always hungry or you're at increased risk of injury because you're not eating enough. So you got to find a balance there. But generally, the leaner you are, and really the smaller framed you are, the faster it's going to make you. So you see some of these runners, they're 6 feet tall and 135 pounds. I mean, I'm 6 feet tall and between 180 and 185, and I'm a fairly thin guy. So you take another, 40, 50 pounds off of me, and what the heck do I look like? I look like skin and bones. Might make me a much faster runner, but that's not something I'm going to do. Also, with running and high performance aerobic activity, it's a matter of what's the percentage of slow twitch fibers to fast twitch muscle fibers. For most of us, it's a 50-50 split, but for the high-end endurance athletes, they may have a much higher percentage of slow twitch, and that gives them an advantage over the rest of us. But from a progression perspective, as you continue to lose weight aerobically, you have the physiologic training variables that are improving. You have increased mitochondria. You have increased perfusion, so you have more capillaries. You have the muscle fibers themselves. Well, with the increased size and number of mitochondria, they increase their ability to do the aerobic activity. All those things come into play to train the individual. Your heart volume can increase, so your stroke volume increases. All those things kind of all go together to improve performance, but those changes are usually fairly quick, 4 to 6 weeks for most. But if the individual has to lose weight, you're going to continue to see improvements as that individual continues to lose weight. So for them, the improvement phase may be longer than for people that their weight is fairly stable and they're not going to change their weight. Yeah, that's what I say. Most improvements will be 6 to 12 weeks. Low fit can be longer. The general VO2 improvements are anywhere from 5 to 20%. You got to look at where you're starting from. If your VO2 is already fairly high and you're fairly active, if you start a specific running program, your VO2 might go up some, but it's not going to go up a lot. So that's where you have that 5%. If you're somebody that's sedentary, it could be more like 20%. And if you're somebody that needs to lose a lot of weight, and you do lose a lot of weight, your VO2 is so low at the start that, yeah, it could increase by larger percentages. I mean, if your functional capacity has you at only being able to exercise at 5 or 6 METs, and then you lose 100 pounds, 150 pounds, and now you can run at 6 miles an hour, you've gone from 5 METs to 10 METs. That's 100% improvement, but it's more of a function of losing that weight than anything else. And so from a percentage, it's bigger, but even that person their max capacity is 10 mets or so. Their VO2 is not extremely high. It's just they were so low previously. Okay, this is a summary. You can read it. I'm moving on. These are nice. It kind of consolidates everything into a smaller, like a cheat sheet, so to speak. So just watch when we get to the volume. Increased daily steps. They add increased daily steps by 2,000 steps. So if you're starting low, to try to increase the steps by 2,000 to reach ideally a step count of 7,000. And that's the number that I'll go off of. What we want is either to increase the steps by 2,000 or for people to get at least 7,000. Yes, we have this 10,000 step number, and that's even better if you get 10,000 steps per day. So it's something great to shoot for. But as far from a health perspective and improving your health outcomes, we want people to get at least 7,000 steps per day. The pattern is your basic aerobic activity, and the progression. And this progression is going to vary. It's going to vary. And one thing you see, since we're with progression, I'll mention this as well, is that when you're looking at sport, if you beat the heck out of a person, you will find improvements quicker. So what happened when you participated in sport? You had two-a-days, and you had all those things you did before the preseason, and you were sore, could hardly move. I dealt with that with my son when he started playing football this past summer. He was sore for like a week or two, which I wish the progression would have been a little bit different, but nobody asks me. But the thing of it is that if you do that, the progression and the improvements will be quicker. You will have a level of pain. You'll have delayed onset muscle soreness, which we'll talk about in another section. But the improvements are quicker. And sometimes if you're getting ready for a season, you don't have time. So if you have a race coming up, or you have a season coming up, or if you have a wedding coming up, or if you have spring break coming up and you're trying to lose weight, or you're trying to have that awesome physique, all those things, then you're limited by time. So then the intensity is going to be higher, the progression needs to be higher or faster in order to see those results. But for most people, when you're looking at the population, we have time. Whether they see all their improvements in 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 6 months, a year, 2 years, it doesn't matter. What matters is that they maintain that activity and try to maintain close to that fitness level as they can. But getting there slow, and this is where start low, go slow, works. But I would imagine that for most of your experience, people beat the heck out of you, and they beat the heck out of you because then you'll see results quicker. And you needed to do that because you had a time factor. You had to get ready for that season. And that season was starting in 2 weeks or whatever it was. And, if you didn't do it, you can't be, I'll get in shape for the middle of the season. Well, then you've lost the first couple games of the season and you got no chance for the playoffs and so on and so forth. So, and we'll talk about it in the resistance section, but this is where timing of the activities and trying to peak at the right time and all that comes into play as well. So with progression, you have to kind of figure out who you're working with, what's going on, the stuff that you're reading, the stuff that you're learning. You can throw it out you just need to put it in the proper perspective and figure out the nuance of who are we talking about, what's the situation, and depending on the situation, the rules and the recommendations change. This is geared towards the general population, I'd say middle-aged and older, sedentary, overweight, that group of people, this works well. But if you're dealing with athletes, this may be a lot more aggressive and you have time constraints and things like that as well. So it changes based on those types of things. Finally, finally, sedentary behavior and activity breaks. Sedentary behavior in and of itself is a problem. Sitting for long periods of time is not good for your health. So we need to minimize that as much as possible. They say sedentary and sitting is the new smoking, great. That means I'm a smoker because I engage in a fair amount of sedentary behavior. So trying to fix that is difficult based on the way things are set up. Dr. Heath, one of my colleagues, his big thing is active transport. So great. If you can do active transport, I walk to and from his office, and now I'm at 5,300 steps. So doing that little walk basically to Erlanger and back, that helped me get my steps. If I drove there, I wouldn't get those steps. So active transport is one way, taking activity breaks. Structured physical activity, which is what a lot of us are doing. All these things are ways to counteract that. But if you're sitting for long periods of time, just getting up, walking around, doing some sort of small levels of exercise, all of that is also helpful and recommended. So do that. For these lectures, at least, I stand. It makes me feel more comfortable. Generally, if I'm doing work and I stand, it hurts my back, so I don't do that. But if you stand and you feel and it's fine, you don't have any back pain, then standing in a standing desk is one way of doing things. So even though we want people to be physically active, and even if you're like me and you're sitting, doing the activity is counteracting some of that. But if we can make the day more active, that's something that would be good too. So kind of take that into consideration. That sitting and sedentary behavior is in and of itself a problem. And if you're sitting for 23.5 hours of the day and you exercise for 30 minutes a day, kind of meeting the recommendation, that's not the best either. It's a little bit of an exaggeration, but that's not the best either. So kind of take that into consideration. How do we decrease the sedentary and increase the active? Okay, that's enough of that.